Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hey everyone, it's Mikki here. You're listening to Mikkipedia. This week on the podcast, I speak to Andy Blow, founder of Precision Hydration, all about hydration. Funny that. We discuss Andy's initial interest in the area, coming from an athlete background and his own experience with hydration and getting it wrong, and how this led to the creation of Precision Hydration. We discuss the accuracy of the sweat test, because I've got to be honest, as I was with Andy, I wasn't really bought into the idea. And we talk about what it can tell us, what is a field-based test any athlete can do to determine their hydration requirements, why some athletes sweat more or lose more sodium than others, and any sex-based differences that we need to be aware of. And we also talk a load more because Andy is great at explaining things. He's a really good athlete, and we discuss his work with his athletes and also what his response is to sodium deniers and people who don't necessarily believe that we need to consider sodium to the extent that Andy and Precision Hydration does. So I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation because there are a number of objections which are met and which we have a really good discussion about. And I really liked that. It was quite a good open discussion. And for those of you unfamiliar with Andy, he is a sports scientist with a degree in sports and exercise science from the University of Bath. An expert in sweat, dehydration, and cramping, Andy previously worked as a team sports scientist for the Bennett and Renault Formula One teams and remains an advisor to the Porsche Human Performance Centre. He was an elite level triathlete in his younger days. Apparently, he raced against Dr. Dan Plews. Andy has finished in the top 10 of Ironman in 70.3 races, as well as winning an Xterra world title. It was Andy's own struggles with cramp and dehydration that led to him specializing in electrolyte replenishment and founding Precision Fuel and Hydration. He is a leading figure in the world of sports hydration and has worked alongside Dr. Raj Jutli, as well as other top sports scientists, to co-author a number of studies and books. And we have a link as to Andy's bio in the show notes and, of course, to Precision Hydration. All right, guys, enjoy this conversation. Andy, thank you so much for taking time with me this morning to chat all about hydration. And I don't know if you'll approve, actually, but I have coffee and an electrolyte drink to supplement. I've just come in from a run, actually, the conversation this morning. And we're actually going to be speaking about both of these. You're an athlete, I imagine we're all athletes, but I understand that you were an athlete before you were a sports scientist. Can you sort of share a little bit of your background?
Yeah, definitely. And by the way, I'm impressed because I know that we're talking at 6:30 a.m. your time. So if you've already been out and done a run, that's pretty good going.
I'm an early morning person.
Yeah, I'm an early bird as well. So I'm often out, but maybe usually my runs start at 5:30 or 6, but not a lot before that.
Yeah, to be fair, it was particularly early. But I figure that, by the time I finished with clients at 10, I've basically had a day, so then I can just faff off for the rest of it. So it's not too bad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, all good. So my kind of athletic background was playing football, like most kids in the UK, most lads in the UK anyway, when I grew up. I clearly wanted to be a professional footballer. That seemed like the good life. It became pretty apparent fairly early on that I wasn't going to go down that route. I did a bit of cross-country running and swimming as a kid, not to any great level. I kind of ran at English schools, but was making up the numbers as opposed to worrying anyone near the front. And I swam a little bit for a swimming club, but again, I wasn't going to nationals or anything. And then kind of in my mid-teens, got into endurance sports. My dad took me to a triathlon and I did a biathlon, which was like the swim run equivalent. And I think, I kind of remember still quite vividly seeing the cool bikes and that kind of stuff and thought I fancy a go at that. So got myself a road bike, started to get into triathlon, and then used to get VHS videotapes of Dave Scott and Mark Allen doing the Ironman in Hawaii, and watch Trans World Sport on a Saturday morning for all the crazy things. Used to watch Steve Gurney doing the
yes,
coast to coast race in New Zealand.
Yeah.
So I was inspired by those kind of things. I actually got to do the coast to coast race a few years ago as well, which was a kind of a bucket list thing for me. But yeah, kind of that got me into endurance, and I pursued that pretty persistently for a number of years. Again, a bit like the professional football thing, I really wanted to go to the Olympics. It became apparent that although I probably got a bit closer to that than I did to being a professional footballer, I didn't get, I was never worrying the top 5 or 6 triathletes in the UK. So I was making up the numbers in the national team and doing Xterra, switched to doing Ironman and all that kind of stuff. So, and then since then, I kind of stopped racing seriously in the early to mid 2000s. I actually mainly stopped, if I'm honest, because I had to have a pretty big knee surgery. And since then, I've kind of bitted and bobbed around doing all the things that the surgeon told me not to do with a rehabilitated knee, but it seems to be holding up at the moment, and we're a few years past that now.
Nice. And so can you still like run and stuff?
Yeah, I have to be a little bit careful with the frequency and intensity of what I do, but I've run some marathons and some ultras and stuff, and it's more about like not running every day on it, I suppose. Just have to be a bit careful.
Yeah, for sure. Random, how old are you, Andy?
45.
Okay, yeah, cool. Because you just like sort of listed off a whole range of your athletic career, and it seems like quite extended. So I'm like, oh, I think you're older than what I thought you were. And yeah, true, you actually are. So obviously, as an athlete, how important was nutrition to you? Sort of going through it, particularly, I guess, suppose in your later years, obviously, because we're a little bit more attuned to things like that.
Yeah, I think early on, I look back on my career like probably a lot of athletes do, and realise that, especially the era that I was in the 90s and early 2000s, although the knowledge on nutrition and hydration was starting to become more, it was a bit more out there. This was kind of pre-internet, really. There wasn't so much stuff on the internet, so everything was a bit behind in terms of knowledge transfer from what was going on to athletes. I don't think, looking back at it, I engaged with it as much as I should have done. I think I left some good performances on the table because of a lack of focus on nutrition and hydration. And I certainly, but what I did have was some really bad experiences with hydration, because I have a really, really high sweat rate and I lose a lot of salt in my sweat. Both were facts that I learned right at the very, very back end of my career. And I learned them out of really doing some very desperate investigation, because so many races were getting ruined. I spent years trying to qualify to go and do the Hawaii Ironman, and I managed to qualify a few times. I went once and I had such a horrific experience because I just screwed up my hydration. I ended up with hyponatremia. I ended up putting in a pretty ropey performance, and it kind of put me off from going back and doing those things. And after that, I did some sweat tests. I learned about electrolyte loss. I learned about fluid loss, and I managed to put it into practice for some of my later races, even though it was towards the end of my career. And it was like, it made such a huge difference for me that when I went on, and all throughout that time, although I was a sort of semi-professional athlete, I was never truly completely full-time. I always worked doing something, and it was coaching or sports science related. And I kind of went into sports science more heavily when I stopped competing as an athlete, and sweat testing and hydration and all of that became an immediate area of interest, and has ultimately led to the business that I run now, which is Precision Fuel and Hydration.
Yeah. So, Andy, I find it really interesting because I speak to a number of clients, endurance-based athletes, and I have a lot of them who are similar in that, they've either qualified or they're trying to qualify for Kona, and they go to a hot environment and they're just like, I just don't do that well in the heat. And and I'm listening to you talk, and I'm wondering how much of that is truly they're just not very good in the heat, or actually is it just something that they're missing with their hydration practice? Like, do you have a sense of, are they actually one and the same? Like, if someone can dial in their hydration, then actually, I mean, all things obviously acclimatizing to the environment is important as well. But do you think a lot of those issues could be mitigated with that correct hydration sort of?
Yeah, for me, that was absolutely the case. I went into races in the heat extremely well conditioned, extremely fit, extremely well prepared, but completely unprepared from a hydration and electrolyte replenishment point of view. And the mistake that I was making was drinking probably too much fluid and not taking enough in anywhere near enough salt. And there was that balance was all out of whack for me. That being said, I don't think I would want to sell the idea of getting your hydration right as a magic bullet for racing in the heat. We work with a lot of elite athletes that that perform well in the heat and some that really struggle in the heat. And sometimes it can be due to other genetic factors. Sometimes it can be due to a bit more due to your body type. If you're a bigger, more muscular athlete, often you're producing a lot more heat and finding it more difficult to offload into the environment. Sometimes it can just be that some people aren't particularly adept at modifying their tactics and strategy and pacing for the heat. That's a huge thing, especially in endurance racing. If you want to race well in the heat, in my opinion, if you're struggling, you need to learn to kind of keep a lid on your efforts and pace. You can't afford to race in a very spiky and emotional way and going hard on the hills and chasing people and this, that. You've got to learn to sort of, the heat is like a weight pressing down on you, and you've got to accept that, and you've got to suppress your performance levels a little bit. I think I'm right in saying that it was Jan Frodeno in triathlon who was interviewed about Kona, and he kind of said, look, the heat out there is the equivalent of racing at altitude or something. It just takes something away from your performance. You have to accept that. You have to accept you're going to be 10% of your watts down on the bike, and you have to accept that you're going to be 15 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds a K slower on the run because of that heat. And I think there are, and I would put myself in that category as well. There are a lot of athletes that are unwilling to accept that. So they want to do their best performance in the heat, and they can't mentally cope with this idea that, okay, in the heat I've just got to back off a little bit, and then I think that can undo their performance. So it's kind of complicated, but I would say that, stating the obvious, hydration is such a huge component of racing in the heat, and especially if you're someone who has a high sweat rate or has a high level of salt loss, then it's an area that you need to be nailing before you go and try and do your best in a hot race.
Yeah, sure thing. And Andy, obviously I'm talking to you today as an expert in hydration and electrolytes. We're going to go through the details. At the time when you were figuring it out, who did you turn to? Or what information was sort of available for you?
So the first port of call for me was the internet, the early internet, and it was actually ultra running forums on the internet. So this is where I obviously did a lot of Google searching. I've still got some of the folders of stuff that I found back then, and a lot of the people that were chatting about electrolyte balance and hydration were people that were running 100 milers. So I remember jumping into some of the early Western States 100 forums and hearing stories of people that they were a bit like, they resonated with me. It was people, and there seemed to be all this controversy, which there still is, about some people need loads of salt, some people don't, some people swear blind that it's not a thing, some people think it really is a thing, that you can ask 10 people and get 10 different answers on it. But I was in a kind of a desperate position where it's like, well, I've got to try something. So I started reading this. I started taking more salt tablets and things. And then in parallel, I talked to a friend of mine who was a doctor, a heart surgeon, and he obviously has a massive amount of knowledge about electrolyte balance in the body, and he looked at the symptoms I was suffering and looked at some blood test results and looked at my clothing after races, which was caked in salt, and said, look, all of what you're describing is consistent with like massive fluid and electrolyte loss. We did a very simple spreadsheet, like what are you taking in, what are you losing. There's a massive delta between those two, and we just closed the gap, which essentially boiled down to like me taking more salt and drinking less water, a little bit less water.
Yeah. And so, Andy, can we do like a bit of a 101 on sweating, on electrolytes, just to bring people up to speed? I mean, I know it seems pretty rudimentary, like surely athletes will know this stuff. And I think there's obviously some base knowledge, but I think that, the way that you describe it, it's a lot more nuanced, or there's a little bit more to it than what I think we might think it is, or the importance, particularly as you say, you talk to 10 different people, you're going to get 10 different answers as to the importance of it. So first just the physiological process of sweating. How does it impact an athlete's performance?
Yeah, so sweating is your body's response to a rise in core body temperature. So your core body temperature, there's lots of things in the body. I'm sure most athletes will be familiar with the term homeostasis. So homeostasis is your body trying to keep certain physiological parameters within certain ranges. So your blood sodium levels are one that we will probably talk about in a bit, and your blood glucose levels might be another. Your core body temperature is one that now operates in a really narrow range. So usually it's about 37 degrees Celsius. If it drops significantly below that, you go hypothermic, and if it goes significantly above that, you become hyperthermic. But the range is small. So if your core body temperature is below 35, you're in trouble. And if you're above 39.5 or 40, you're also in trouble. So when your hypothalamus in your brain detects a rise in your core body temperature when you exercise. And the reason your body temperature goes up when you exercise is because exercise is quite, muscular contraction is quite inefficient. You don't produce a lot of power compared to how much heat you produce. I think it's like 23% efficiency for a cyclist, doesn't it? It's like really, and cyclists are very efficient. So it's not actually, a good system in that respect. So all this excess heat is being thrown off, and you've got to offload that to the external environment. Otherwise, you're going to cook yourself. And so what happens is the hypothalamus detects a rise in core body temperature. It sends neurotransmitters down the chain to your sweat glands, which are at the surface of your skin, all over your body, and tells them to produce sweat. And the sweat is drawn from your blood plasma, from the capillary bed. It goes onto the skin and evaporates away. And that evaporation is what cools you down. And the simplest way to think about how effective that is that feeling that when you jump in the sea or in a swimming pool even on a baking hot day, when you get out and a little breeze comes past, you feel instantly quite cold. And that's because that water's evaporating off. And that's the effect that your body's taking advantage of when you exercise and sweat. And so although sweating can be seen as a bit of a bad thing or an Achilles heel for athletes, without it, we wouldn't be able to exercise in the heat, which is why if you take your dog for a run in the winter, it'll kick your ass. But if you take it for a run in the summer, you'll leave it standing because it can't sweat and thermoregulate in the same way that we can.
Okay. So, and you mentioned, you yourself have quite a high sweat rate. I actually think I have quite a low sweat rate. I remember being on a treadmill doing a lactate threshold test maybe 15 years ago. And the coach that I was working with at the time, he's like, "You're not sweating." And it was like super hot and there was like no aircon, and I just didn't really, I had a glow on, but I certainly wasn't what he was expecting. So obviously there are individual variations with sweat rate for people.
Definitely. And they can be quite substantial. So the biggest sweating athletes we deal with, not exclusively, but they tend to be the bigger athletes. It kind of fits, doesn't it? Bigger body size, you're going to produce more heat and you've got more fluid to lose, so you're going to sweat more. So we've seen elite tennis players, 6'6" tennis players, sweating 4 or 5 litres an hour, which is pretty incredible. We also see small, and often it is female athletes. There seems to be a little bit of a discrepancy. Although female athletes can sweat as much as male athletes, there's an overlap in the middle. The lower sweat rates that we see tend to come from female athletes, and the higher sweat rates tend to come from male athletes. So you kind of fit in the bill as a smaller female athlete. Maybe it's not entirely unexpected that your sweat rate would be on the lower end, but it is kind of super individual. And we also deal with problems at both ends of that spectrum, because although if you don't sweat very much, it is kind of good for conserving fluid, it can hold you back in hot conditions if you're not able to cool adequately. At the same time, the guy that I mentioned who's got like a 4 or 5 litre an hour sweat rate, he was actually a South African tennis player, Kevin Anderson. He was a Wimbledon finalist, and he would typically really struggle in the heat because he couldn't keep up with his fluid losses. So he had heat stroke. He collapsed a couple of times. He had lots of problems with cramping and stuff because you can't physically drink 4 or 5 litres an hour. He was impressive in that he could probably drink 2.5 litres an hour. But even so, it doesn't take long for a big amount of fluid loss and electrolyte loss to compound and leave his body in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, for sure. And you'll likely be familiar with, well, actually, I don't know, Jim Cotter and his work in... Yeah. And so I recall, because I studied phys ed at the same time, well, he was just coming into the department, and I think in a couple of my final years. And as I recall, his group reanalyzed hydration data as it related to performance. And so up until this point, we thought that a certain level of dehydration was, and it was quite a very small level of dehydration, would be detrimental to performance. But his analysis of it suggested that the way that we looked at the data prior to his group doing it, and I don't know if it was just his group, but in fact it was the way we were analysing it sort of gave us skewed information about the relationship between hydration and performance. In essence, what I'm asking is, to what extent does dehydration impact negatively on performance? Like, how dehydrated do you have to get?
That's still kind of like the $1 million question, because it's more complicated than people love a simple answer to what sounds like a simple question. Like, okay, so the human body, we must be able to tolerate X amount of dehydration before we suffer Y decrement in performance. And it's just not that simple an answer. The early research was quite motivated. It was funded in such a way that it was quite motivated to prove without doubt that dehydration was catastrophically negative for performance. There's been a lot of stones thrown at some of the earlier work that people like the Gatorade Sports and Science Institute did, because they were funded by Sports Drink, and obviously the aim is to sell more sports drinks. So how can you do that? Well, if the marketing people get hold of the data, they want to say dehydration's a real negative. You need to drink. And a lot of Tim Noakes wrote a whole book about it called Waterlogged, and to try and correct all of this. And there were the way studies were done, for example. I think one of the things that Jim and his group maybe critiqued was some of the studies would forcibly dehydrate people and then get them to exercise. And that's not very representative of what really happens. You don't sit in a sauna not drinking even though you feel thirsty and then go for a run. I think we all know that if you do that, your performance is going to suffer. However, it's a different dynamic if you start a run well hydrated, but then incrementally dehydrate because you're not drinking during that run. Maybe your body treats that situation differently. Maybe it has different physiological consequences. So if you forcibly dehydrate someone by 2 or 3% and then get them to exercise, you're going to see a drop off in performance. If you see someone drop their body weight by 2 or 3% throughout an exercise bout, maybe you're not going to see that same level because the body can kind of cope with it. But I would also say, I'm out here in Spain at the moment working with a cycling team, and they're doing some very interesting heat training protocols out here. So one of the things they're doing is they're doing a 5-hour ride outside in moderately temperate conditions, 15, 18 degrees. They're coming straight back, they're putting all of their winter clothing on and sitting on a trainer indoors and spinning on for another hour with no fan, with only a limited amount of fluid. And they're trying to create a heat training stress adaptation, to boost blood volume and that kind of thing. But they're playing around with their hydration protocols, because if they don't drink enough on that preceding 5 hours, and if their body weight drop starts to become too severe, they immediately can see it in that final hour, that they either can't complete the hour, that their heart rate gets out of control, that they feel absolutely terrible. And even a small amount of additional drinking actually enables them to perform that hour in the heat to a much more comfortable degree, and they can perform better. So I think, as one example there, maybe you can suffer a bit more of a percentage body weight drop in colder conditions where there's not quite so much pressure on your cardiovascular system to provide cooling. But when you're exercising in the heat, I think dehydration can be quite catastrophic. So I actually wrote a blog for our website, which might be worth sharing with you if people are interested in this topic. And it basically says how much dehydration can you tolerate before your performance suffers? And it tries to dig into it. And I guess the punchline is it's probably somewhere between like 1% and 4% or so, maybe 5% for some people, but it's not necessarily a fixed solid number. And it's something we've all got to learn by trial and error for ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm thinking about, there are differences in the type of athlete as well, and not necessarily just body size. But you mentioned genetics as a potential sort of reason for why some people might sweat more or less. And I'm just thinking about like world record performances by marathon runners, and obviously these guys and females are out there a whole lot less time than your average marathoner. So maybe it's a time thing. So they don't have the time to get quite as dehydrated. I don't think they're drinking a whole lot from the research that I've seen. But could there be something genetic about those individuals that means that they don't suffer the impact of dehydration to the same extent that someone else might have under a similar condition?
I think like you, my sense on this is that there's numerous genetic factors that give elite athletes the potential to do the performances that the rest of us can only aspire to do. Probably it is true. I've never seen any research, or I don't know what those factors might be relating to the ability to tolerate dehydration, but I'm pretty certain that, like in other ways, maybe they can either produce less or tolerate lactic acid or resynthesize lactic acid better, or or carry oxygen better and deliver or expel waste gases better. There's got to be loads of different incremental things that come together. I think some of the papers that have looked at elite marathon runners dropping a huge amount of body weight during a race, what they don't necessarily articulate is the fact that, the famous one is about Haile Gebrselassie, I think losing about 7 or 8%, maybe even 10% of his body weight at the end of a marathon where he ran like 2:04, which at the time, 2:04 is still a world-class time, but at the time it was like close to the world record. And, when I would almost be certain that when that guy stood on the start line for that race, he's not at his normal baseline body weight. He's carb loaded, he's well hydrated. I used to stand on the start line of a race 2 or 3 kilos heavier than what would be a standard training weight, because if you really do aggressively carb load and take on some additional fluid and salt beforehand, although you are starting a bit heavy, you are packing a reservoir of energy and fluids and salts that you're going to burn through in the race inside, and so it's beneficial. And whilst he dropped maybe let's say 8% of his body weight or whatever it was, is that a true representation? Is that 8% the same as losing 8%? I would argue potentially not. And so I think that's one factor that doesn't get discussed. The other thing that you've already pointed out is actually these guys at the sharp end. A marathon is an endurance event for anyone, but it's only 2 hours for the faster men, and it's only just over 2 hours nowadays for the faster women. So that's a whole different proposition to someone who's going for 3 or 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah, for sure. And Andy, you mentioned sex difference briefly when I was just talking about my sweat rate, and you said, smaller female, etc. Are there any other known sex differences that might change how we approach hydration in a meaningful way? I mean, sex differences in a meaningful way that actually we have to consider. I know a lot of people talk about it.
Yeah, I honestly, I feel like at the moment the evidence sort of suggests that the answer to that is no, not really. I think there's the physiological demands on men and women doing endurance in the sort of cardiovascular aspects that are most affected and heat management aspects that are affected aren't really affected by male female sex difference too much. It's like there has been talk, and there have been papers written about the difference in fluid retention and fluid loss at different times of the menstrual cycle, but a lot of the summary of all of that, and again, Abby, one of the sports scientists who worked for us at PFNH, wrote an article about this because we got asked the question a lot and looked at all the evidence and kind of came out on the side that, look, there are maybe some slightly statistical differences in the way women's bodies handle fluid at different times of the month compared with men who are obviously more stable in that regard. And but does any of this really add up to like a substantial enough difference to affect the way you hydrate for performance? It's like, well, not really. You know, the biggest difference is you as an individual. If we took your data and didn't know your gender, whether we just know your sweat rate and we know your sweat sodium concentration, and we know the same for a guy, we could give you a hydration plan that is compatible with that. It doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman.
Yeah. No, that's as I understood it as well, which is reassuring. Andy, you've mentioned, obviously we talked fluid loss, and we've mentioned a couple of times, obviously, sodium. So can we just have a brief chat about the role of the electrolytes, particularly, I mean, sodium, obviously, but, you know, if I'm looking at a sports drink, I'm also going to see magnesium and potassium, and people sometimes get a little bit hyper-focused on the, this is my opinion, on those nutrients, as opposed to, as I understand it, sodium, which is the one that might almost matter, but I might be wrong about that. So it'd be good to chat about those electrolytes.
All electrolytes are really critical in the body, and you have to ingest them because you can't manufacture them. So they all perform different roles. A lot of them are to do with electrical conductivity, nerve impulses, balancing of potential around cell membranes and communication and that sort of stuff. So when you get electrolyte imbalances, all sorts of catastrophic things happen. You know, if you get a really big imbalance in potassium levels, it can affect your heart, for instance, because heart muscle, when they do a heart operation, the way that they stop the heart beating is they infuse a load of potassium into it. So, you know, you have to be super careful with when you're messing around with electrolyte balance. The reason that sodium gets so much airtime as an electrolyte that matters to athletes is because your sweat comes from your blood plasma, and the predominant electrolytes in your blood plasma are sodium and chloride, salt, you know, table salt. And whilst you do lose some potassium, magnesium, and calcium, you lose those electrolytes in relatively small amounts. And even in ultra distance activity, it's arguable that you're not going to lose them in amounts that become physiologically significant. But sodium and chloride, but sodium in particular, you can lose enough of even in 2 or 3 hours if you're a heavy sweater, that can put your homeostasis out of whack and cause a cascade of problems. So sodium is touted as the most important one for athletes, and that is true. All of them are important, but as long as you're eating a balanced diet most of the time, sodium is the one you want to be looking for on sports nutrition products, because it's the one that might help you maintain your performance if you're losing a lot of sweat.
Yeah. Okay. And, you know, you mentioned that you were a salty sweater, and this was indicative, a lot of salt on your exercise gear. Indicative of the fact that you're dumping a lot of sodium, therefore you need more. Whereas one of the things that I've heard is that if you're dumping a lot of sodium, you don't need the sodium. So, you know, I think there are a lot. So how does that, what's the deal? What's the go with that?
Yeah. Most of the sodium regulation that goes on in your body is done at the kidneys, not through sweat glands. So you sweat out sodium, and there are genetic reasons why some people sweat more sodium out than others. They're not fantastically well understood, but there have been done biopsy studies and things where they've looked at the structure of sweat glands. Some people have more channels for reabsorption of the sodium and chloride ions than others. Some people, the hormonal factors control a little bit how much sodium gets reabsorbed. In an extreme case, people with cystic fibrosis have a genetic condition that doesn't allow them to reabsorb a lot of sodium at all, so their sweat is incredibly salty. And so there's this big range of difference between how much people lose. And what we've found with our testing, and we've done a lot of sweat testing now, is that number for you is relatively stable usually. So my sweat is and always has been extremely salty. Other people we test only lose a small amount. And whilst I've heard the argument before that, you know, you are wasting salt if you're sweating it out, I'm not going to say that that's not entirely, you know, it's not implausible that by taking in more salt, you might see more on your clothes. But more often than not, in conversations with athletes that we have, and it was certainly the case for me, it's like, it doesn't matter how much salt I do or don't take in, my kit is encrusted with salt. You know,
Yes.
I've literally come on to talk to you, having walked off doing a sweat test with a professional Tour de France rider who's been riding in the pro peloton since 2007, and he did a sweat test for the first time today, and he said, look, after every race, my jersey will stand up on its own. It's like so crusted with salt. I have cramps. I have problems in the heat. I've learned to combat this by like taking more salt, having more electrolyte drinks. But he's really curious to know what's the deal. Well, sure enough, we sweat test him. His sweat sodium score is like double the average.
Wow. Yeah.
And he's learned that the hardly. So I don't want to, and I wouldn't dismiss what you're saying, that there may be cases where some people, if they're taking loads of extra salt, there may be a mechanism by which some of that ends up getting leached out in their sweat, because it does end up in your blood and yada yada. But at the same time, I would caution against the blanket, like, well, if you're taking too much, if you're seeing salt on your skin, it's because you're taking too much salt. I've seen way too many compelling cases that would completely refute that.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really good to know. And I think I want to talk to you about the cramps as well, because I mean, you're in the trenches looking at athletes every day and thousands of athletes, and I think there's real value there. Whereas if we're just looking at literature or other indicators of the importance of electrolytes or how people sort of lose fluid and electrolytes, then you can miss. That's your only evidence that you're sort of drawing on as your evidence base. I think you can miss a lot of real life stuff. Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned your cardiologist friend talking about blood markers of electrolytes. And I have actually seen a couple of papers over the last couple of years talking about athletes who appear to have lower levels of magnesium and potassium sort of blood markers. Is this another way to sort of, for athletes to look at their electrolyte requirements, or are they a little bit too generalized? As opposed to getting a sweat test when you're in that exercise setting?
Yeah, they are potentially very useful, but they are also categorically kind of two different things, because what we're measuring when we do a sweat test is we're trying to model what you are going to lose from your body over the period of time that you're racing and training. So we're interested in modeling your sweat rate, how many litres of sweat per hour, and we're interested in modeling how much sodium is in that sweat. So if we keep the numbers simple and say, Mikki, you're losing 1 litre of sweat per hour with 1,000 milligrams of sodium per litre, that means every hour, roughly, you're going to lose 1 litre of fluid and 1,000 milligrams of sodium. Extrapolate that up, and you can, for a 5-hour race, it's 5 litres and 1,000 milligrams of sodium that you're going to lose. When you look at blood markers, that's kind of downstream, that's internal. The body's trying very hard via homeostasis to keep your electrolyte levels in balance. And so if you do a blood test and show up as being low or deficient in magnesium, potassium, there's probably something along the lines of like a dietary insufficiency, an inability to absorb it. Maybe you're wasting some of those electrolytes for some reason. It could be medication you're on, or it could be a medical condition. And so the upshot of that might be that you address that with more dietary intake or supplementation, but it's not necessarily going to be that you're deficient in that because you've sweated it out.
Yes,
and it's probably more,
sense.
it could well, or it's more likely probably to be a more chronic thing rather than an acute thing, because sodium and fluid loss during exercise is a very acute problem. You can have no problem, and then 3 hours later you can have a massive problem. Whereas low magnesium is more likely to have come on over a long chronic period of time.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And speaking of obviously the testing, which is what I want to chat to you about, I will be honest, Andy, like, because I've heard of sweat testing for like the last, 15 years, and I've always been skeptical. I've been like, well, you're sitting down. I'll get you to talk me through the process, actually, because this is it. I don't actually know about it as much as what I probably think I do. I probably have this idea and I'm completely wrong, but I'm like, how can a sweat test determine someone's losses, an athlete's losses, like at one point in time, if, for example, they are out doing ultra marathons in hot environments, or they're doing Ironman in the freezing cold, or an Olympic distance in a different events, different environments. So I was I was skeptical of the value of a one-time sort of test. But can you talk me through the process? Because I have different feelings about it now after listening to you on other podcasts. So I'd just like to have the conversation.
Yeah, no, and I think it's always kind of healthy to attack these things from a skeptical point of view. If I rewind to tell my story in a bit more detail, just to start with, like when I sat down with Dr. Jutley, my cardiac surgeon friend, he said to me, look, there's a test we can do to see how much salt you lose in your sweat. It's very well medically validated. And he said, I bet you will be like super high on that scale. So I was like, okay, well, I've got nothing to lose here. He's going to hustle me in the back door of a hospital and get me a free test of my sweat. So we sat down at the hospital, did put electrodes on the arm, stimulated the sweat glands. They took a sweat sample, ran it through a machine. Sure enough, the guy goes, that's really high. That's 1,800 milligrams of sodium per litre, which is like double what the average person loses. And Dr. Jutley's there all smug, takes a $5 off me or whatever and, wins the bet sort of thing. But the reason that the sweat test is the sweat sodium test is potentially very useful as a one-time test is it's quite, like I said, it's quite static within individuals.
Yeah.
We do occasionally see cases where maybe the number moves around over time a little bit, but they're rare, and we've tested and repeat tested a lot of people. We've also more recently done a lot of back-to-back testing with sweat collected during exercise and sweat collected during our stimulated analysis, and the two numbers converge really nicely. Case in point, the athlete that I just mentioned, this cyclist that I've just been working with today, the reason he came for a sweat test with us is not only because of all the symptom history he's got, but also because the cycling team did some sweat testing on him earlier this week. His numbers came out super high, and they were like, that's interesting. We want to verify that. We want to get another data point on that. And sure enough, our test married up pretty well with their on-the-road exercise test. So that's not uncommon. We see that all the time. And so measuring your sweat sodium concentration, we liken it to knowing what your t-shirt size is. It's like you don't need to know exactly, because it's a physiological variable. It's going to be a little bit different one day to the next. But if you know whether you're a small, a medium, a large, or an extra large, or in this case like a low, a moderate, a high, or very high, then that gives you a really interesting data point to then plug in against also your sweat rate, also the weather conditions, also the intensity of the exercise, the duration of the exercise. And you start to be able to say, because I would say if you start at the extremes, like categorically, you would say someone who has low sweat sodium, who has a low sweat rate, who's doing a short distance event in cold conditions, does not need electrolyte supplementation or even a lot of fluid supplementation. Let's go all the way to the other end. Someone who's got very, very high sweat sodium, who has a high sweat rate, who's competing in a long race in the heat, and who's also very fit, so can push themselves very hard. They need a shitload of fluid and electrolyte supplementation to keep them on track. And if you bookend everyone between those two scenarios, like clearly we're all on that spectrum somewhere. And so this is what drives me insane with the argument around sweat testing, electrolyte supplementation, or whatever. It's like there's a lot of very clever people out there who can't seem to accept this premise that this is a spectrum. For some people, we can say, no, you don't need anything. For other people, we have to say, yes, you really, really need a lot of everything. Like I can't tell you how mental it drives me that there are people that would just, oh, well, no, the sweat test is a waste of time because we can just everyone just needs a bit of sodium, or the extremists who are like, no one needs to replace sodium. And it's like, well, there's just too much evidence which you are willfully ignoring that suggests that this is a spectrum. And it's like it does amaze me how dogmatic it's become. And I've, maybe rightly in the past that I've been accused of obviously banging the drum for the benefits of sweat testing, the requirement for sweat testing. And for me as an individual, I have to recognise my own biases. It was insanely useful for me, and it's incredibly helpful for me. And therefore you kind of, you want it to be useful and helpful for everyone. And maybe it isn't. But also, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's not that it's not useful for anybody. Like some of these people that are banging on it regularly in the sort of sports science, coaching, nutrition media at the moment about how sweat testing or sodium supplementation is a waste of time, they are effectively denying that I exist, in terms of not me as a commercial entity, but me as a human individual. And what has been gratifying over the years is a number of elite professional and amateur athletes who appear to suffer with the same problems have gravitated to us, have asked us the questions, had the tests, followed the protocols, and quite often have outstanding results as a result. And so, it's kind of, I've probably gone on about that enough, but that's a real sore spot for me in how, the dialogue around all of this is being perceived in the media at the moment.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And as you were describing, it might be a one-time sort of test, or not a one-time test, but you're in a certain environment and do the test. Then of course my logical brain kicked in as soon as you started talking. I went, oh, of course you're just then going to go, well, this is what I'm like in this sort of a static environment. Obviously it's going to play out slightly differently if the environmental conditions are different. So that makes perfect sense. And for sure, Andy, I've come around to your way of thinking much more than what I was maybe 10 years ago or even 5 years ago around the utility of knowing your sweat rate. Because, of course, there's sweat rate, but there's sodium loss as well, and they can uncouple, right? So you can be a low sweater, but actually lose quite a bit of salt within that. Is that right?
Definitely, yeah. So we look at it like a quadrant graph like that. So on the bottom left of the graph, you've got people with a low sweat rate and a low sweat sodium concentration. And above them, you might have a high sweat rate, but a low sweat sodium concentration. In the other corner, you've got a low sweat sodium concentration, but a high sweat rate. And in the top right-hand corner, you've got the people like me who've got a high sweat rate and a high sweat sodium concentration. And if we do a sweat test, we can effectively kind of plot you onto that graph somewhere. And the further you skew towards the right and the upper right, the more attentive you're going to need to be about your hydration. So I keep talking about it because it's very relevant to me at the moment. But here with the cycling team, they've got a beautifully simple system for doing this. They sweat test everyone. They look at their sweat rates and their sweat sodiums. They categorize them as kind of low, moderate, or high requirements for fluid and electrolytes. And then on the bike in races, they have 3 bottles available. They have a blue cap bottle, which has water. They have a white cap bottle, which has carbohydrate drink. And they have a red cap bottle, which has a carbohydrate plus electrolyte drink. And the nutritionists, just based on the weather conditions, the length of the race, the likely intensity, they program it in for the riders that, the saltier, heavier sweating guys will need more bottles and more of the red top bottles because the high proportion of electrolytes along with carbs. And then the cooler the conditions, the lower the sweat losses, sodium losses, those guys will drink more of the white top bottles, carbohydrate only, and then the water is used to kind of supplement as and when, if sometimes you just need a bit more water, and they'll use it, like that. But they get so many of their calories and carbs from their liquids that it's kind of mainly a binary decision of like, are you a guy who needs exclusively electrolyte carb bottles? Do you need a mixture of carb, electrolyte and carb only, or do you just need carbohydrate only because you don't have a high requirement for salt at all?
Do you see many of those athletes, Andy, like the ones that legitimately could run a 30K trail event, not worry at all about salt?
Yeah, we see we definitely see some people. We've tested someone here this week with really, really low sweat sodium concentration. We literally have seen both ends of the spectrum. And that guy was a guy who's like a podium rider in the Tour de France, and he's like, well, I don't worry too much about salt intake. It's just not a thing for me. And sure enough, his sweat test score shows he loses like literally less than half of what the average person loses in their sweat sodium wise. So for them, accumulating sodium loss is just not a big problem in races. Whatever the sports nutrition they're taking and food they're eating is obviously balancing it out. It's a non-issue. So you don't worry about it.
Yeah. And then is there any detriment to taking salt if you don't need it? Like what is the potential pitfall? As I understand it, When I talk about salt with people, I'm like, well, you're going to know if you don't need it because you're going to need to go to the bathroom pretty quickly, because salt can have that, like too much sodium can have that effect on some people. But like, should, if you're just taking salt tabs because you've been told, but for example, if you didn't need them, would there be anything, what would be the downside of that on a longer end?
The big chat in the cycling teams, and we've seen this with some riders, is that if you go like in this pro cycling world, the Vuelta a España is in the relatively hot part of the year in August, September. It can be a scorching race, like 40 plus degrees, and guys that are recommended to take more salt and do so unnecessarily, like they don't lose a lot of sweat and salt, they can gain body weight because sodium helps you to retain fluid, and you gain. So that's one potential detrimental side. The other thing as well is that salt is controversial and there are different opinions about it, but too much salt in anyone's diet is seen and deemed to be a bad thing.
Of course.
So it could, it's like anything to excess is usually bad. So when we recommend certain people take a large amount of salt, it's not actually what I would determine as being in excess. It's just to meet their higher requirement. They have higher requirements. It's to meet those needs. Would you advise someone to just go crazy with the salt? Whatever. Like, probably not. It's not a good idea. I do, and I have been on record as saying, in many circumstances, I would say racing in the heat, sweating a lot, a little bit more salt than you perhaps need, rather than a little bit less. I see there being less downside and more potential upside. But I'm also aware that encouraging athletes to take more of something is a dangerous game, because as soon as you tell athletes that more of something is going to help them, some athletes will double it, some will triple it, and then there'll be one out there who will 10 times it. And then, you've just got to be real about that. When I say a little bit more, it's like it is a little bit more, not a multiple of.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned that one of the cyclists you were working with, they did their own sort of sweat testing out in the field, and they wanted another data point, so they came to you. What was their exercise test? Was it the simple sort of, they weighed themselves, they jumped on and rode for a while, and they accounted for their consumption, and then they weighed themselves again? Is that the sort of field test for testing your sweat rate?
100%. Yeah, that's what they do. Real simple. Just do it accurately and do it repeatedly so that you get an average of data. Yeah.
Nice. That's good. That's what I tell my people to do too. Yeah. So I'm glad that we agree. Andy, you mentioned cramps, and this, I see this a lot. Like, I've got friends who are sodium deniers, and other people who swear by it for cramps, because as I understand the state of the literature, you can't look at the literature and conclusively say, yep, it's an electrolyte. No, it's a sodium or a salt loss issue. However, what I see with some clients is that unless they're taking a lot of salt, they're either going to get cramps, or they do get cramps. And of course, if they get cramps and they take salt, the cramp resolves. So in your sort of clinical experience, is what you see different to what I might read in the literature about the importance of replacing sodium? Like, how does that sort of sit?
Yeah, I'd say the literature in the last, I don't know how many years, but probably the last 20 plus years has swung to being way more conservative, or even in denial of the association between electrolyte and cramps. Kevin Miller, who's based in Texas, has very recently written some more balanced papers, I feel, on the kind of multifactorial aspect of cramping, being honest in the fact that no one really understands cramping that well, and that multiple different reasons and remedies seem to exist. From my clinical experience and my own personal experience, I would be fairly confident in saying, like, look, with endurance athletes, especially those competing in the heat, somewhere between 70 and 80% of cases seem to either be helped by or resolved by taking more salt. And in the absence of any, there isn't a really strong rationale for exactly why that might be. But there's also like hundreds of years of history of people using salt effectively to reduce cramping, in people working in mines, in people stoking boilers on ships and on trains, in people in the military, in American footballers in the US, and in lots and lots. You talk to old school endurance athletes, and they'd be like, "Oh, you're cramping? Take more salt." It's like a thing. And whilst it is good to be skeptical and question things, again, it's a bit like the whole "do we need sodium?" period question. Like there is always people in sports science like crusading through to make their name, and a great way to make your name is to just come in with this: everything we knew before is wrong. Now it's this. And I always say to athletes, if you're suffering with cramps, let's have a look at your fluid and electrolyte intake as one part of the equation. Let's try it. Let's try playing around with those values, because it's effectively close to free as an intervention, or like very, very low cost, extremely low risk. And if it works, you've probably solved your problem, and in a really simple way. Like if it doesn't work, okay, let's look elsewhere. But let's try the simple stuff first, because a lot of people say, "Yeah, I've tried electrolytes," and then you look at what they've tried. Oh, they've tried dropping one electrolyte tablet into a litre of water and dissolving it and diluting it to the point of it being ineffective. There are ratios and dosages, and we've got, again, I keep referencing them, but we've got a great blog on our website about cramp and the kind of protocols to follow. And I think if people are honest and if they follow those protocols, we get, honestly, into the business each week, we probably get 10 emails from people who are so ecstatic and over the moon that using the stronger electrolyte products has relieved their cramps or resolved their cramping. And of course, like I was as an athlete, you find a problem. If you're a persistent cramper, you find a problem that solves it, you're going to stick with it. This always reminds me of that famous story in like biology or physics or whatever it is around the bumblebee that can't fly, because the scientists have worked out that the body weight and the way it flaps its wings and everything, like the bumblebee can't fly, but no one told the bee, and it kind of just flaps its wings and takes off. And like, we don't know how and why taking more salt and fluids potentially helps with cramping, but a lot of athletes, fortunately, seem to not care too much about what those scientists are saying and are willing to try it. And for some of them,
yeah,
all they needed to know.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And I would say as an athlete and a clinician, like the problem of cramping, it's like stitch. Like, we don't know a lot about that either, which is one of the most common things that occurs. And you've got like 18 different ways with which you can resolve it, and probably 27 ways or sort of reasons for why it occurred. But, it could be any number of them on any sort of given day. It's just one of those sports science mysteries.
Exactly. Yeah.
Andy, so what do you do with a sweat test then? And are they available I understand they're in Australia. In New Zealand, do we have precision hydration sort of gear here?
Yeah, you do. You've got a couple of people doing sweat testing, actually. So Russ Smith's one of them. And all the details are on our website, actually. So if you go onto Precision Fuel and Hydration, search for a sweat test centre near you, or just email our squad at hello@precisionhydration.com, we can put you in touch with a nearby test centre. So yeah, sweat testing every week or month at the moment. We're installing more sweat testing machines in more places. So it's available fairly globally now. It's a very simple test. If you do it our way, you sit down, we put some electrodes on your arm, stimulate the sweat glands, take a sweat sample, and we can tell you the electrolyte composition of your sweat. So the end to end, the actual physical part of the test takes 15 to 20 minutes. It's probably a 45-minute appointment with the practitioner, who can then talk you through the results. And then, as well as being able to talk to that practitioner, you get some decent emails from us about the results, what they might mean, and a direct line of inquiry to talk to our sort of squad in the UK. We have a sports science customer service help team in the UK, and they're always on hand for emails, free video calls to talk you through the results and try and see what we can learn about improving your performance with this element of your physiology.
Super interesting. So from that test, part of the consultation would cover how you then take that information and put it in this particular training session or that particular training session. And you also have salt tabs, don't you? I'm so ignorant. I'm so sorry. But is it the like below 500 you talk me through it. Is it 250, 500? Like,
Exactly. Yeah, we have 4 different strengths of electrolyte drinks. So like a 250, which is super light, 500, which is kind of regular strength, 1,000 milligrams a litre, which is strong, and 1,500, which is super strong. And then we also do a carb drink now, which has electrolytes to the concentration of 1,000 milligrams a litre. So that's called carbon electrolyte drink mix. And that you can, the idea with all of those is that you can tune your electrolyte intake based on your physiological needs, based on the demands of the event, your sweat rate, the weather conditions. Not that you need to be tweaking this like all the time. It's not like fine tuning, but it just means that unlike basically all other sports nutrition brands out there, this gives you the ability to pull on this lever and adjust it to suit your needs.
Yeah. And Andy, do you have any opinions on like some of it? Because there are a number of companies now that are coming out with higher sodium options, like sugar-free higher sodium options for not just athletes, but just people in general. So there's like Element would probably have been one of the first that I've seen. But now, particularly in New Zealand, like they've just the same formulation or, just complete rip-offs. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but it seems like they've just taken that formula and then just run with it. I've seen a number of these products. Do you have opinions on that or?
It's based on, most of those products are based on very roughly based on the World Health Organization sort of oral rehydration salts mix, which has been around since the 70s, 80s, when it was discovered that if you put sodium and glucose together in a drink, you can actually in that case it was for rehydrating people who'd had diarrhea and sickness, usually due to cholera or something pretty nasty, and it was just shown to be so much more effective way of rehydrating. So it's kind of, a lot of these companies go with the medically proven marketing tagline or whatever, because it's essentially kind of based on that. I think that they're very popular because companies like LMNT have done fantastically well in something that you take every single day is a great subscription business model. If you can say to people, right, you need to take one of these packets every day, you know what, sign up, we'll send 30 of them to you a month, and have at it, and it'll make your life better by being optimally hydrated. Then there's a beautiful simplicity in that, and it kind of works commercially. The products definitely aren't bad. I would say in general, the science is right, but it's a very generic approach to be saying to people, you just need to take one of these a day, and everything will be better. Like, I'll use out here in Spain when I'm getting up really early in the morning, doing some training myself. I'm on my feet all day. It's warm and dry. We're living in aircon. Like, I'm using quite a bit of our product just on a daily basis. When I'm at home, if I have a day off training and I'm not doing it like that, I don't start the day with a litre of electrolyte drink. It's just like unnecessary. So the nuance is missed, but I can see why they're becoming popular. And it does seem to be a bit of a trend. It's a bit of a thing, and I think we're falling back on this general perception. The public still has a general perception like hydration is good. I'm probably dehydrated most of the time, so maybe rather than like thinking about it any more deeply, I'll just buy one of these, throw it in my water, and get on with my day.
Yeah, and I think as well a pushback to the likes of Gatorade and those other sports nutrition products, which historically have had lower sodium and it's sugar, and a lot of people who might not necessarily need a sports drink would pick up something like that from a hydration perspective. So I suppose that these other companies, and I will admit to being a complete fan of Element, just because they just taste so delicious, and also have to admit I've never tried a precision hydration product. I'm so sorry, Andy, I've never come across it before. But anyway,
we can correct that. That's easy.
Okay, great. But yeah, a bit of a pushback to those other companies. Albeit you mentioned the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. I think I can't recall actually what if that is in fact what they're called. But I think there is a lot of good information on that website, Gatorade or not. Yeah,
Absolutely, yeah. They
yeah.
just got a bit of a bashing in the early days for. I mean, they're a proper sports science institute. They do some great work,
Yes.
but there was a phase, I think, perhaps in the 80s, maybe in the 90s, when they appeared to exert a sort of outsized amount of influence on organisations like the ACSM because they were funding a lot of that, and they were pushing this message that, you know, hydration is all that matters. You know, they famously, I think it was in '96, the ACSM guidelines kind of basically said athletes should drink as much as they can tolerate. And then you get all these cases of hyponatremia, you get people over drinking. There was no kind of ceiling put on it, and that's what Tim Noakes and some of his colleagues, and kind of there was a few people that really called that out, and I think that was a good thing. But what's annoying about that is they went so far as to like rubbish the idea of sports drinks and hydration. And Tim Noakes' message was basically, just drink water when you're thirsty, you'll be fine. You know, that's all you need to worry about. And it's like, well, maybe for 98% of the population, you know, who aren't particularly competitively active or doing a decent amount of sport and exercise, that's probably okay advice. But for some of us, it's downright dangerous advice.
Yeah, no, for sure, Andy. I totally appreciate that. Your thoughts around that. So I'm mindful of the time, and so can we just finish up, Andy? So obviously I'm going to link to your website and a couple of those blogs that we've talked about throughout, because I think that they will be super helpful and interesting. And also, I'm pleased to hear Russ Smith and someone else in New Zealand, and the fact that precision hydration is global, not particularly expensive, as I understand it, as well, as far as sort of testing goes for athletes.
No, it should. I think a sweat test, I don't actually know what the price is in New Zealand dollars, but it's going to be around about a couple of $100 New Zealand dollars to get a sweat test, I'd imagine, based on our pricing in the UK. And it actually, one race that you're probably aware of, the Tarawera Ultra Marathon.
Oh, yeah, doing the 50.
Russ is going to be there doing sweat testing, I believe, because he's there at the expo, and we'll have some of our products there and stuff. So maybe we can connect you to go and see him there and have a chat. And if anyone's listening to this before that event and is in the area, you know, that's a chance to go down and connect with someone who knows a lot about the brand.
Oh, that is awesome. And so we'll definitely make sure we publish that prior to Tarawera. That would be great. Andy, where can people find you in Precision Hydration?
All over our socials, you know, Precision Fuel and Hydration, just search us up on, you know, Instagram or wherever. I think the most valuable resource we have is the Knowledge Hub on our website, which is precisionhydration.com or precisionfuelandhydration.com. Both of those URLs take you to the right place. And if people have got questions or they want to, you know, they've listened to this and it's sort of stimulated some questions, I would say go onto our website and contact us through our email system. It's hello@precisionhydration.com. All emails get an answer by a human. There's no kind of bots or AI, or things don't just get ignored. And we actually really love talking to people who've got problems to solve with their nutrition and hydration.
That is awesome. Thank you, Andy. And probably the most important question to finish off with, who do you support in the football?
Well, I grew up in Leicestershire, so I was a Foxes fan when I was younger. Used to go to Filbert Street quite often. Can't really claim to have stayed loyal. I live down in Bournemouth now, and I can say this because there's no way he'll be listening to it, but my just turned 10-year-old son, I've just got him tickets to go to one of the next Bournemouth games because we're kind of trying to support the local team, and they do use Precision Fuel and Hydration products, so it's kind of hard not to support someone who uses our stuff.
Yeah, no, nice one, Andy. Well, I'm glad we got all the way to the end of the podcast before me asking you that, because my husband edits this podcast and he's a huge Arsenal supporter. So, yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear that, but you know, I'm sure he's lovely in other ways.
Andy, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate that.
No, lovely talking to you. Thanks, Mikki.
Alrighty, hopefully you enjoyed that. It was a real fun conversation from my end. And, you know, I was obviously very ignorant as to where you can find sweat testing and precision hydration, but we outlined that in the show for you guys here in New Zealand. And all going well, I may be getting myself a sweat test this weekend at Tarawera. Next week on the podcast, I speak to Dr. Gil Blander, and he's from Inside Tracker. So we do a bit of a dive into blood biomarkers and particularly looking at athletes, but also just healthy individuals. Until then, though, you can catch me over on Threads, Instagram, and Twitter at Mikki Williden. Head to Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition or my website, mikkiwilliden.com, and you can send me an inquiry or book a one-on-one call with me. All right, team, you have the best week. See you later.